Good afternoon. Robert Rodriguez, Chairman of Security Innovation Network. Round two. We're going to talk about new models, collaboration, as we spoke briefly earlier about the formation of Office of Strategic Services, CIA, et cetera. The intelligence community has been using or partnering with academics for many, many years. I think there's a great opportunity for those involved in the world of cyber to continue those type of models and collaboration to advance the security field. If you think about your very bright people at the greatest institutions here within the United States, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, et cetera, and then the industry and the government trying to protect their networks, their brand, their reputation, the warfighter, et cetera, and they're good at what they do. But I'm very, very strong advocate and believer in partnering and bringing in the practitioners with the theorists. I believe that's where you can create your centers of excellence. And I'll let John Mitchell a little bit later, talk about the experience that we had when I was in the Secret Service, when our agents came into a meeting and said, this web spoofing thing, this is 8-9 years ago, it's going to be a big, big problem. And look where we are today. We were able to get a grant from DHS at that time and have a think tank of industry government folks, and 9 months later, SpoofGuard was born and put into the infrastructure at eBay. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Steve Elephant, Chief Information Officer of Heartland, Melissa Hathaway, Harvard University, former Senior Director, Cyberspace, National Security Council, General Michael Hayden, former Director of NSA and CIA, Dr. Doug Mon, Program Manager, Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology, and Dr. John Mitchell, Professor, Stanford University, Computer Science Department. First question goes to you, Doug. Earlier this month, auditors from the Government Accountability Office stated the government does not have a prioritized national cybersecurity research and development agenda. Officials don't have the ability to track all active and completed cybersecurity programs, and a process to sufficiently share key information between government and industry. The report went on to state, without a current national cybersecurity R&D agenda, the nation is at risk. That agencies and private sector companies may focus on their individual priorities, which may not be the most important national research priorities. The lack of a national agenda makes it more likely that programs won't reflect national priorities, important decisions will be postponed, and agencies will lack overall direction, according to the GAO. Doug, do you agree with this assessment? And if so, what steps do you recommend that will improve upon the current state of affairs with this issue?
Well, for the most part, yes, I do agree with the statement. The GAO came out. The last real national research agenda that was articulated came out of the Bush White House in 2003. And we have been working on some of the things there that were in the R&D agenda of 2003. But just as Deputy Secretary Lute mentioned this morning, I think we're still lacking that national agenda that says what's important, what are our priorities. There have been roadmaps that have been developed, agendas that have been developed. DHS S&T, in fact, put its own agenda out there earlier this year, but it's not necessarily a national agenda. So I think on Howard Schmidt's plate is, in fact, to do a national agenda, and that agenda is also supposed to include the R&D pieces of it. As for the tracking, that is the case. Agencies do R&D, and some agencies are better at publishing their results than others. And we also have the issue of classified research versus unclassified research. But I think The GAO was very critical of the government. I co-chair an interagency working group, and we are in fact having those discussions about tracking and making information more openly available. There's also the issue you have to ask yourself, which is, if we if we publish everything we're doing, is that also a good thing as well? So that discussion has been happening, but I'm a firm believer in accountability and transparency. While those are popular words of this administration, I think they're absolutely necessary from a research and development perspective, because that will also provide the bridge to partner with private sectors. If they know and understand what the research community is doing, they'll be in a better position to partner with us to help take that into a commercial marketplace.
Thank you. Same question over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Robert. During the Bush administration, the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, CNCI, there was Initiative 4, which was looking at how does one track all of the different research and development programs across the government and start to bin them so you can do portfolio management. What are we working well at and what are we not looking at? And we looked at where were all the research initiatives across the government from the 2003 agenda and then the 2005 National Information Technology Research and Development Council, the priorities that they had looked at from the President's Science and Technology Advisory Council, PCAST. And with that, there were 10 priorities for information technology, many of which have been carried forward under Doug's roadmap that was published in November at DHS. And what we found when we did the catalog in the 2008 timeframe of the over $4 billion of information technology research per year, we were only looking at and investing in 3 out of the 10 priorities. And so it showed the importance of rebalancing the portfolio towards the national priorities. I think that the GAO report is true, that we need to have a more focused research agenda going forward. And with that, we have a number of initiatives that have been announced by the Obama administration for smart grid, health IT, next generation air traffic control, broadband to America, just to name a few. But they're not actually focused toward a national economic infrastructure roadmap of how do we modernize them as they're all moving toward the internet and what are the security needs. And so if you start to look at what is that infrastructure roadmap and you start to track what all of those different piece parts are going into, I think it would help focus the administration's research and development initiatives and help us work more with the private sector and academia.
Thank you. Over to you, Professor Mitchell. Some have said that our nation has dropped the ball on translating science into innovation. A majority of research is sleeping in filing cabinets, unable to be fully realized by entrepreneurs, innovators, industry, or the government, who may be able to create value out of it. According to the National Academy of Sciences, roughly 0.1% of all funded basic research ever makes it to commercialization. With Stanford University being the #1 technology transfer academic institution in the world, what can you do, or what recommendations do you have to improve this statistic? And does it mean better licensee technology shops, more oversight, incentives, decentives? Why do some succeed and others fail?
Well, first of all, I think I'd like to be clear that I'm lucky to live in a good neighborhood, but there are many smart people all over the world, excellent universities with fine research and good innovative ideas that can be commercialized as well. From a university standpoint, there is a gap between what's funded as basic scientific research and things that make excellent spin-outs. I think in order to enable innovation, we need a research culture that values new ideas that have some application or potential impact in practice. And we need also in the research community to value evaluation of ideas that reflects either current or future deployment criteria. Sometimes these things are just absent from the review process. The research culture is more oriented towards, or in many cases oriented towards, easily evaluable things that contribute to promotion and tenure and hiring, and not everyone has a clear view at what will be useful in the long run. I personally don't think there's a difference between useful and scientifically interesting. The reason why the core basic problems are core basic problems is every time you scratch a practical problem, you reach something fundamental underneath. You know, that's my personal view. You mentioned licensing practices and so on. Some universities are more creative and take the longer view, whereas others are somewhat short-sighted. I think in order to bring a university-developed idea into the commercial marketplace, it's helpful to have a university licensing process that supports success. I know of some universities, they're university of some state, let's call it, that have asked for cash from startups before they have a product, before they have any revenue stream. I think that really just inhibits the success of that startup. If the university really wants to make money, it needs to help the entrepreneurs get started, do whatever it can, give them free licensing, give them a chance to build their company. And then, if people are successful, the university's been helpful to them. I think many successful entrepreneurs then turn around and are generous back to their university. So many places are a little bit short-sighted on that. Looking back at some of the more successful startups from our university and others, I think that students are really often the key factor. There are a few startups that are successful that have been started by faculty taking a leave and being the technology leader, but for the most part, it's students who come in, who pick up ideas from the research project, and then are willing to go out and leave and devote several years of their time to building a company. So there's a little bit of a culture supporting students to do that, and some places seem to have a better ability to do that. But if you can get students energized and give them the material to go forward, and then work with them as they go start their companies, I think that's been a successful model.
Thank you, John. Same question to you, Doug. What can we do to improve this challenge? Why do you think some succeed, most fail? And you've got some case studies, Iron Key and other companies or startups that you've funded.
So I think the first thing to note is that your statistic of 0.1% of basic research makes it into commercialization. You have to look at the full spectrum of research, which is not just basic, but then applied research into test and evaluation and transition. We've been successful at DHS largely because we do the full spectrum. So while I can take John's basic research that he might do at Stanford, help them develop it into a further product. If they don't want to productize it, we, the government, have opportunities to productize it, to help them partner with industry, et cetera. So I think some of the things that are important, one is looking at the different models for funding. So if I'm an academic, I can go get research funding from a government agency, I can go look at a venture capital, et cetera, and so there are some different decisions there. If I'm a small business, one of the best programs in the government right now is what is called the Small Business Innovative Research Program, or SBIR program. We've had very successful companies that have been acquired over the last couple of years where they got their start as an SBIR. It's only available for companies of 500 employees or less, but we've had one company bought by Microsoft and two bought by McAfee, both of which all three of which have been folded into the core products of the companies, right? So it's really a matter of helping those academics and small businesses and even large businesses figure out how to commercialize. I think one of the other key pieces for us has been test and evaluation. So prior to DHS, I was at DARPA for 4.5 years and very frustrated with building technology. I funded over $200 million in research in 4 years and watching very little of it actually make it in the commercial marketplace. One of the ones that did came out of Stanford. But so we changed the model when we went to DHS, and the model now includes a test and evaluation process. So the research programs and projects have to go through a test and evaluation process. So we put them in front of the fire hose in an operational environment, either with government or with private sectors, and make sure it's going to work. And then we provide the assistance and help, whether it's a university or whether it's a company, down the transition path. I believe that model is why we've been successful. We can point to over 20 either commercially available or open source available products in the last 5 years because of that model.
Now to the early adopter, Steve. What made you take a chance using Voltage, a Stanford University computer science spin-out, a white paper when I first met the principal investigator, Professor Dan Bonnet, 7-8 years ago, on building the first end-to-end encryption platform in the payment processing sector? What recommendations and lessons learned do you have for other corporations who are considering collaborative research projects, the ROI, the risk, the trust, the brand, value, time, and investment?
Well, Robert, Heartland had a large problem, what was reported to be the largest breach in U.S. history of credit card data, over 100 million records. I was asked to come in and help to fix that. My background had been as a serial entrepreneur, having been a CEO of 7 startups and then in venture capital. And the same things that I looked for there in terms of best of breed products, unique technology, the best and the brightest people were the characteristics that we looked for to help fix this problem with end-to-end encryption. There's a challenge with trying to use pure startup companies in that as a Fortune 1000 company, we have to know that the technology and the principles are going to be around for the long run. One of the things that we liked about Voltage was the fact that it was a venture-backed company. They had made it over the hump. They had been tried and tested, not in the payments industry, but in other applications. They had the capital, they had the right management team, and we looked at 50 different encryption companies, technology companies, and they were mostly Me Too products. And when it came down to it, Voltage and the technology that had been spun out at Stanford was the true best of breed. We paid more money than we probably would have had to for other things on the market, surprisingly, even though it's a new technology. But in hindsight, we're now 2 years into it practically, and we've been able to commercially launch it, have over 3,000 merchants that are using it, that are protected, and it's getting good uptake in the market. So we were able to work with a startup very, very effectively.
Thank you. General Hayden, the Office of Strategic Services during and post-World War II called upon the titans of American academia to Washington, D.C. to partner with the emerging intelligence community. In mid-1941, William Donovan recommended to President Roosevelt that in organizing the Foreign Intelligence Service, he should draw on the universities for experts. That core focus resulted in the essential composition of the OSS. General, as mentioned, the intelligence community has been partnering with academia for many years. Why is this program so successful, and how can we model this to develop a stronger and more viable cybersecurity research partnership between industry, government, and academia?
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to be a little bit negative here in a minute, but let me just say a few positive things about cooperation between the IC and academia. There's actually let me talk about, since it was my last job, analysis. The amount of dialogue between the analysts we had at CIA and academic specialists on different areas of the world was actually very rich and very profitable for both sides. So there is some core good news here in terms of continuing that OSS tradition of relying on, again, the resources in American society. It is more challenging for us today, however. We have become victim to broader cultural trends that have made it more difficult for the public sector and the private sector to cooperate. One example was, we talked in the interview earlier this afternoon, the Dana Priest, Bill Arkin article that made it a bit of a sin for the government to rely on private sector expertise for about anything, or at least the burden of proof has to be on the government when they're not using the government to do things that the government needs to have done. So you've got that kind of cross current that makes it more difficult. There are also cross currents in academia that make this more challenging. Let me stick in the analytic lane for one or two more verses here and then go on to technology. Think of what American academia has done since 9/11 and compare it to the performance of American academia in, say, the 10 years from 1949 to 1959. If you take 9/11 as a seminal event that changes American security attitudes, you go back to the post-World War II era and you look at Paul Nitze and a document called NSC 67, which was, in essence, the foundation of deterrence and of the long competition with the Soviet Union that ultimately ended in success. Look at the retooling American academia did in the 10 years after Nitze and NSC 67 with regard to Russian language courses, Soviet studies, studies of Marxism, and so on, and compare it with the far smaller retooling of American academia after the 9/11 attacks. Yeah, I know. There are more Arabic language courses on American universities. But again, compare the scale to the retooling 49 to 59 and 2001 to 2011. And you'll see that for broader cultural reasons, that the broader American culture is not as responsive to American security needs as it was a half century ago. Now let me drive the point home and be a bit unfair, and it's an exceptional example, but it's not an untrue one. Right? We have in Afghanistan something called human terrain teams. These are teams that we're very sensitive about. We don't attach them to the J2. We don't attach them to the intelligence organization of the regional brigade. They're kind of freestanding. They report to the commander. And these human terrain teams are designed for the commander to kind of, how to put it, to gain the kind of knowledge of their area of operations that you and I had for our neighborhoods growing up. You knew who was related to who, you know what street corner you could hang out on in the daylight, and you know which ones you could not hang out on after dark, you know the streets you could go down this time of day. I mean, you get it. I mean, just all those deep interpersonal relationships. They're a wonderful idea. We have turned to the American Anthropological Society to use their science and their discipline to help these human terrain teams. It has become a moral question of the first order for the American Anthropological Society as to whether or not they will participate, and on balance, they say no. That's the biggest difference between Bill Donovan going out to academia and saying, hey, I need a little help here, and Dave Petraeus or Stan McChrystal going out to the same or somewhat same academic community and saying, I need a little help here. So that's been a real challenge on what I'll call the liberal arts side of the equation. Frankly, I think we've been more successful on the technology side of the equation. I think government's been able to have a richer dialogue. It's been able to toss more problems into your inboxes, I think, than we've been able to do on the softer science side, and we've benefited from it. And I'll stop there.
Melissa, same question.
Well, I think that we have established how do we incentivize or get the venture capital mindset into the U.S. government and create almost a safe cutout. And with the establishment of In-Q-Tel in the 1990s, that's how the intelligence community would feed requirements into a venture capital group with venture capital from the government to look for the innovation in the small businesses or communities and say, well, that's an interesting idea, but here's how you might want to tailor it to a customer that I might have. And it's a unique way that at least the intelligence community has used a neutral third party to do the hunting and gathering of interesting technologies. So I agree with General Hayden that that's something that the community has done a very good job at. The Department of Defense has a similar concept that they launched in the less than a decade ago called Da Vinci, that I think is not experiencing as much success as the In-Q-Tel model has, and I couldn't necessarily diagnose that. As you look at what the OSS had as a unique focus area, the period of 49 to 59 was a very unique era of where we're faced on looking at just a bipolar world and one particular area of really space and aerospace areas. And I think now there's so many different priorities, it's hard to keep a focus on. But what I think would be interesting is if we looked beyond just the United States and we looked at how do we start to align research agendas with common problems with our European and other allies. If you take the example I used earlier, the United States government is spending over $5 billion a year, or close to $5 billion a year on information technology and research areas, and that shortfalls. The European Union is also spending another 1.4 billion euro. And as they're looking at proposals, the proposals have to be responsive to multinational priorities, and they have to have multinational or multiple companies involved in the solution. If we look at that collectively, we all have the similar problems in cyberspace and on our core infrastructures. So what if we were to start to look at unique alliances with our multinational corporations, with our respective government dollars, towards creating a new type of partnership and view that the OSS had in a bipolar world.
Thank you. To Steve, cybersecurity is fast becoming Washington, D.C.'s growth industry of choice. Appears to be in line for a multi-billion-dollar injection of federal research dollars, according to a senior intelligence official. Don Myrick's Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Acquisition and Technology said that along with the White House Office's Science and Technology, her office is going to sponsor major research where the government's about to spend multiple billions of dollars. This newest element of the Federal Cybersecurity Initiative will not be looking for what Myrick's called classic Beltway commercial answers to be applied to today's hacker problems at federal agencies. She stated we need to be really innovative or we will run out of runway on our current approach. The question to you, Steve, is new technologies in the industry can be implemented quickly. The counterbalance is the agility of where the government has oversight. So you have agility and then they have oversight, needs, requirements, common criteria, et cetera, that inherently slow down the process to integrate. So why does industry move quicker, and what lessons can the government learn from being more innovative while balancing a risk-adverse culture?
Well, Robert, I think what we've learned is that we have to be proactive rather than reactive, and we really have to think the adversary. In our case, as an example, we're dealing with the 21st century bank robbers. These are not 14-year-old hackers. These are organized criminal gangs that are out there to wreak havoc in our financial institutions. And ultimately, the government's fighting the same people, whether they're going after military secrets, they're going after the grid, the financial infrastructure. And I think that's where operating at internet speed that the government needs to understand, and really putting together the public-private partnership concept. It can work. We found after our breach that unfortunately there were people in the government and in industry that had knowledge of the specific malware that hit us, and had that information been able to be shared and moved at a much faster pace, we could have avoided $130 million cost and a major $700 million hit to our stock price. So I think it's really fundamentally operating at internet speed, and we've got to outthink the bad guys.
Thank you. General Hayden, the Manhattan Project was a code name for a public-private partnership initiative during World War II to develop the first atomic bomb. It started as a small research project that was led by the U.S. and included participation from the United Kingdom and Canada. The project included participation in over 30 locations from universities, national labs, industrial plants, and was funded by the federal government. General, why is this type of initiative needed, or is this type of initiative needed to significantly advance the cybersecurity field? And if so, what needs to be done to achieve this?
I mean, obviously the success of the Manhattan Project is clear historically, is a model that worked. That again, without overemphasizing the cultural differences, it worked in a different time. As Melissa said, it was, everyone was very focused. There was general agreement. Imagine, if you will, a project of the Manhattan Project's nature, including what it was they were building, being the product of public-private and international cooperation today, and how many additional issues would be dragged into the problem set other than just the rather relatively simple issue of splitting the atom. And I think you begin to appreciate how much more difficult this is. And frankly, you know, I'll defer to the far better, stronger scientific knowledge to my right here, that in terms of trying to accomplish what we need to accomplish, today's problem is more complex, deeper and broader than the relatively narrow front that the Manhattan Project had to deal with. Let me just pivot off a comment that Steve made, talked about speed of the internet and so on. And you correctly confined your comments, that kind of approach to the private sector. And as you were saying it, I just jotted down a note to myself that I wanted to share. And the government is not designed to be efficient. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you go back to the founding documents, it's designed to be inefficient. It's designed to have conflicts, not agreements, to reduce speed rather than to increase it. So I think if I take that thought and marry it to the Manhattan Project question, you get the kinds of issues that we now have. All that said, and this ties into perhaps, Robert, the first question you asked, that prioritized national R&D agenda, the focus on it, smart investment from government and private, with government kind of herding investment into the right channels, that's doable too. And I think within the art form that government still has available to it.
John, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, let me comment a little bit on this concept of a Manhattan Project and relate an anecdote about an incident or a series of events relatively recently. Coming into the Obama administration, Melissa Hathaway chaired a 60-day review of appropriate technology and problems and priority setting exercise. And in connection with that, there were several groups that tried to provide input. One of them was an NSF organized group, and I was involved in that among others. And in preparing for a teleconference, some of us suggested that we academics, organized by the National Science Foundation, kind of get our act together a little bit before we have an open food fight for external listeners. And what surprised me, I thought that all the academics were on the call were going to get up and say, well, really what the government has to fund is the thing I'm most interested in. And so I was prepared for that. But in fact, as we went through 20 or 25 people saying what they thought was most interesting, I was really surprised that there was general interest in the community in dropping our competitive view of having to beat each other at research and trying to work together on a common goal. So I think there really is an interest in the research community in working together on a common goal. The current structure of our endeavor doesn't really support that, but I think people would be very receptive, and if there was a framework provided, we would be successful at it. So let me just give very briefly one example that's close to my interests. If you talk to banks and financial institutions, one of their top priorities is good, effective, bidirectional authentication between a user at a web browser and a website of a bank or other company that the user is connecting to. And I think that we have the solution the banking industry wants. We just don't know which of the solutions developed in the research community is the one that the banking industry wants. So what we need in order to really make progress there is a process that involves representatives from the financial services industry, other industries could be effective and good contributors as well. And buy-in and attention from the browser vendors, because I think changing the browser platform, if you bring that into the process, we have much greater chance of success than if we don't. And if we have those three parties, people who have research experience, authentication protocols, cryptographic experience that can be brought to bear, the user community and customers, and then the software development and providers, then I think we really could make a big impact in this area by working together. So that's one example where I think a Manhattan Project-like effort could be effective.
Thank you. Melissa, I'd like to thank you personally and acknowledge your commitment and significant contribution towards the White House May 2009 Cyberspace Policy Review, especially as a mother of two beautiful boys and the hours you worked. Thank you. Some of the review conclusions stated the following. The United States should, number one, harness the full benefits of innovation to address cybersecurity concerns. Number two, be careful not to create policy and regulation that inhibits innovation or results in inefficiencies or less security. Number three, work with industry to develop migration paths and incentives for the rapid adoption of research and technology development. And last, encourage collaboration between academic and industrial laboratories. What action have you seen since these recommendations were made, Melissa? And where are we making progress and where are we behind?
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for the mention on the cyberspace policy review. And John, thank you. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to review that document, the cyberspace policy review is still up on the White House website, but I think more importantly, the 100 different papers that we received from academia and industry on asking for help and the proposed solutions are also up on the website. And the paper that was organized by the National Science Foundation had more than 50 academic institutions that participated in it. And it's true that they did put their institutional competitive prerogatives aside and collaborated on papers, and that was MIT and Stanford working together, and the University of North Carolina and Oklahoma State University and others all working together on presenting solutions to the administration on what to do next. I think that the progress that's been made to date continues to be slow, but that is largely challenged by the fact that we're still not having an honest dialogue about what's the threat that we're facing, and we're not sharing enough information with academia and industry. And until everybody has a really good common understanding of what's the threat, whether it's an insider threat or proximity access, as I'm sure has been demonstrated here multiple times through Wi-Fi, supply chain manipulation, and or just the plain plague that we see coming through the internet, we really won't be able to design to the next generation infrastructure that's going to be required. Having said that, the administration is pushing three primary initiatives. The first is looking at tailored trusted spaces. And tailored trusted spaces gets to what John was talking about, is how do we start to get to trusted transactions on the internet? Primarily focused first on the financial services infrastructure, which actually Doug is funding a fair amount of research in this particular area. As you see more and more banks having issues, and some banks now will not allow you to do online banking unless if you've downloaded the appropriate tokens. And in the United States, we have one of our first ever lawsuits of bank suing customer for bank's breach, and that happened in Texas. And I think that that's going to be the beginning of a challenge of online trusted transactions going forward. The second is called moving target, and moving target you need to think about as dynamic defense in a degraded environment. And how do you continue to have an updated dynamic defense and or changing RSA key for, let's just say, the federal space. The federal space doesn't have a dynamic RSA key as you're calling in. And so it's pretty static defense situation in a degraded environment. So how do you continue to be a moving target and hard to find and hard to break into over time? The third area is needs probably the most research, and that's the economic incentives. And we don't have the appropriate economic incentives to solve this problem toward a national infrastructure that needs to be upgraded with security built in up front. The administration just recently announced their national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. And that strategy, I think, is trying to get to identity management with privacy built in to get to tailored trusted spaces, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And with that work, I think that we need to start to look at how we architected the system to begin with was about availability first, confidentiality second, and integrity last. And we have to architecture the future system about integrity first, confidentiality second, and availability last. Because if my email gets to Steve at the speed of light, and it could still be authenticated, it may not have maintained its integrity along the way. And therefore, I don't care if it gets there, if it was not, the integrity wasn't maintained. So we need to turn our, CIA model, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability upside down and start thinking about how we're going to move forward on a common research agenda.
Excellent points. Thank you. Doug, same question. Where do you feel we're making progress and where we're behind?
Well, I certainly think the dialogue on R&D has been improved over the last 18 to 24 months. In the past, largely the government was over in its corner and the industry was in its corner, and we seldom talked about what R&D was important. The only way it worked was the government would put out a solicitation. Sometimes industry would respond, certainly the academics would respond. There have been dialogue opportunities over the last 12 to 18 months where I think that has improved. I still think there's plenty of things for us to do, especially coming back to the discussion of this morning, which is what are the national priorities and how do both we, the government, and the private sector kind of step away, as John pointed out, the NSF guys, all of them, rather than having a food fight for who gets what dollars, it's how do I step away and look at a national priority, even if it doesn't help me as a company, and may actually go against my business plans as a company, but it's in the nation's most important need. And we haven't had those dialogues, as Secretary Lute mentioned this morning. I think one of the other areas that probably we haven't seen progress in the White House policy review with respect to innovation talked about improving the interactions between the academics and some of the labs, both government and industry labs. And at least from what I've seen, we haven't improved that. We still have a significant problem of transitioning technology not only out of the academic world, but even out of the government labs. They suffer from the same commercialization and transitions as universities and even small businesses, and I don't believe we've really improved anything there or made any progress since the release of the review in the last 15 months.
Thank you, Doug. General Hayden, Blackhat has approximately 5,000 attendees. These rooms are full of some of the brightest minds in America. Some black hats, some white hats, but still brilliant minds. What can we do to harness their knowledge that will contribute towards the mission assurance and readiness of our nation's critical infrastructure and command and control systems? Think of the Jeff Moss when he was 19 or 18 years old. How do we capture that person that's on the fence? And Jeff now is on the Advisory Council for Homeland Security.
Robert, I'd suggest maybe a two-phase approach to this. The first at the macro level, and that's to get broad national consensus that these are the things we want to do. And I don't mean, the kind of the overly macro, let's make the internet safer. It's, more specific steps to be done, which will require trade-offs. Trade-offs between commerce and security, trade-offs between security and privacy as we go forward. I don't think we can do that first step without a richer dialogue. And I think Melissa, as other folks have mentioned this afternoon, we can't get to the richer dialogue without more transparency. in terms of what's happening out there. In the government space, it's overclassification. In the commercial space, it's keeping information hidden either out of liability concerns or for the protection of intellectual property. It's got to get lighter. It's got to get more open. More data has to flow. Otherwise, we don't have the adult conversation. We don't have the adult conversation. We don't arrive at the kinds of consensus that we need to kind of harness a unified national effort. That's the first step. The second is then how do you bring young folks with these kinds of talent into this space. That may be more difficult given the distractions that kind of talent is going to have in terms of opportunities. The broader national consensus, I think, is a good step. Continued emphasis on this by national leaders, respected national leaders that call people to service. And then finally, I do think we need to use the same kinds of tools that we use to get people to sacrifice, how to put this, in the physical space, call to service, call to patriotism. We need to find ways to translate that to that particular population group that has the most to offer in this kind of space.
Thank you. Last question will be the same question over to you, John. You have some brilliant students.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of issues here. I think the success of Blackhat really is evidence that this is a very attractive topic area, and it is attracting, creative, clever, and committed individuals. So I think see that as a great opportunity. One thing that strikes me coming here and looking at some of the work here is that something that I also experience in teaching. It's much easier to get people interested in attacking systems than in defending them. And so that's one of our basic challenges is how do we bring the same excitement to defending systems that's easily generated by attacking? And I don't have the solution to that. We have experiments that we're trying in our teaching program. If somebody else has a great idea, please let me know, because I think that's really one of the problems in this area is turning all this creative energy into systems that will help defend us against attacks rather than find them.
Thank you. And we have
Robert,
time
can I point out one other thing that I think is important, and that is there's at least the beginnings of a national program initiative in cybersecurity education. So what has been in the past kind of left to each university or each school's own strategy, I think we're at least starting to have the discussion at a national level of what is the investment we need to make for the next generation with respect to education. It's just in the early stages, but I think that's a plus with respect to General Hayden's comments of trying to bring in the young minds and to bring these, the guys that come to Blackhat on to keep them on our side of the fence and help them in their education process. And then, that translates into jobs and other things as well. So I think that's another good step that the administration, which came out of the policy review, was to create this national level program. And I believe there's a document out off of the White House website where you can kind of see the early beginnings of that program.
Melissa, would you speak to that?
I can speak to the importance of the cyber challenges that have been kicked off, but there's cyber challenges that have been initiated. One's called the Patriot, Cyber Patriot, which is led by the United States Air Force. And that's actually doing cyber challenges at the high school level, where they're putting out key challenges in forensics and intrusion detection and network security at the high school level. And it's a mentor-protege program, so that you have to have somebody who's working with the high school that on a particular program. And I thought it was interesting that the national winner was a high school in Idaho Falls. So Idaho National Lab was the mentor for that particular program. There are other challenges that are underway that at the university level. And the university program, there were 3 winners, and one was a small university in Delaware, and another one was actually international. It was from Taiwan. And I think that it's important that we look at these cyber challenges and how they can advance a cadre I have two other points. This has been modeled now and adopted in the United Kingdom, and they're having their first cyber challenge this week. And it's going university-wide in the UK and with cross-government sponsorship. And Italy is looking at something similar to develop their cadre at the university and high school level. There was a newspaper article in my hometown just about a month and a half ago, and it was a third grader had hacked into the whiteboard to change their homework assignments. Okay, so my kids are getting ready to go into fourth and fifth grade, and we have conversations all the time about, how our mommy's computer or the home computer we don't really want it to be a botnet that takes down Bank of America or God forbid, one of our government agencies. And I think about what is it that would get my kids going on understanding of why we don't want to hack the whiteboard and change our homework assignments and how we can channel that interesting energy. And they're of the Wii and Nintendo and all of these different generations. And there's an interesting program that was just released. It's online gaming, and it won the South by Southwest Gaming Award just a few months ago. And it was called Smokescreen. And it's an online gaming paid for by the equivalent of public broadcasting system and the Metropolitan Police in the United Kingdom. And it's an online game that puts your kid in a Facebook situation, and where they have just put too much information out and their pictures of their friends out on Facebook, and they were approached at a party by somebody who said, well, I know your friend, John, and it looks like, and knew too much about them personally. And so it was a child predatory environment and teaching them appreciation of being more conscientious of what you put online. And a second one was more of a high school, or it could have been college, doesn't matter, right? Pick your scenario. Announced a party on Facebook and to their Facebook friends, 40 people, right? And 1,000 people show up. And so what do? Do you call mom? Do you call the police? Do you try to cancel the party? To put them in different situations. And I thought that was something that my kids would adopt immediately. Because they would play it and they would learn the lessons, because they're not going to listen to mom, and they're definitely not going to listen to their teacher. And so how do you start to think about unique ways to communicate to the generation who's grown up on more technology than my generation has, and teach them the lessons in an environment that it's like Mario Brothers for cybersecurity. So how do we move that forward?
Great points. Are there any questions before we wrap up? Yes, please.
Yeah, I've got my question's kind of maybe a little bit broad, but I'm hearing a lot of discussion about how you get, coordination between the government, research, and the industry itself. And I've always found that historically one of the biggest demoralizing aspects of any project I've ever worked on is ambiguity. And at the same time, I've always found that working within the government industry, that I find one of the hardest things to work with any of the agencies I've dealt with, is getting them to hammer down actually what the requirement is of what they want accomplished. So my question is in these activities that we're working, are there any real initiatives going on as to how to really define the problems that need to be solved, or are we taking more of an approach of a more broad technical aspect versus, I think, a more definitive, we need to do this, and this, which then creates criteria for success?
So I can just give you, at least from the DHS perspective on the science and technology side. So, we start with the research in a fairly broad funnel, right? And then, you make some choices about what research looks like it has some promise based on interactions with a customer, whether that customer's in the government or in the federal space or in the private sector. We have some projects with some state users as well, but then you funnel that down into a development process that, you're targeting a certain set of users, and then you put it into the test and evaluation, put it in the operational environment, and you let that user provide feedback to the researcher, whether they're academic or company. And then what you end up with is a user at the end of that funnel who's ready to take the product when they're done. And that's the model we've tried to build within DHS, is to ensure that when we get done, it's not just going to go on the shelf, that it has commercial potential. And we've even, in some cases, helped build the partnership between whether they're an academic or a small business with someone who can help them commercialize it, whether that's a system integrator or even, so one of the small businesses that was bought by McAfee, we actually did the introduction between McAfee and the company at one of our events. That's where they first met. So, part of our job, we believe, is in fact being the marriage broker, but it's all about taking the technology from a fairly broad idea to start with and putting it through a process that actually ends up with real stuff coming out the back end that can be deployed and commercialized.
I think just from the government side of the ball, associate myself with your first comments. I was director of a national agency for about 10 years, NSA, Deputy DNI, and then CIA. And I learned very painfully, very expensively, that moonshots never worked. We had one transformational program at NSA that I spent hundreds of millions of dollars for and ended up with a really good stack of view graphs and not much more. And a significant portion of the problem was the indiscipline within government of defining and sticking to discrete requirements rather than to allow the requirements to grow over time in the dialogue so that you were always 18 months away from any IOC. By the time I'd lived through that experience and got to CIA, no moonshots, low-hanging fruit was great, incremental improvement, get stuff on the desktop and move forward.
Hi, I'm a academic from Canada, and I have a question about how to, as an academic, how do we encourage government to work with us? I come from a different culture or climate, I suppose, having taught in the US for 3 years and just relocated back to Simon Fraser to start a cybercrime program, of cybercrime studies and research, and we have a research institute. So I've been trying to foster relationships with the Canadian government and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, and it's been extremely difficult because I traveled to Ottawa and was told in no uncertain terms that they wanted to handle the research internally. And the Canadian government, in fact, has lagged very far behind both Europe and the US in enacting legislation. We only just enacted identity theft legislation in October 2009. We have no laws combating spam or viruses and so on. And I guess as an academic, I'm finding that there are two major obstacles. One is in terms of generating reliable statistics, having to rely largely on anecdote and a lot of the research that's coming out of the US. Part of my work has been with child pornography, and most of our statistics are coming from the US and other research outfits. And so for the sort of the naysayers, the cyber libertarians, I like to call them, who are very adverse to any kind of regulation on the internet and so on, that the reliance on those outside sources and statistics allows them to say, oh, it's not really a problem here. We don't really need to address it. So that further, sort of fans the flames of doing nothing to combat these problems. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is, if we can't work with the government, we can't get statistics, and we can't really conduct our research in any effective sort of way. So I guess I'm sort of wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how do you start from ground zero? I mean, we're the first cybercrime studies program, cybercrime institute in Canada. And without this collaboration, I'm finding it very, very difficult.
So I have two quick thoughts. One, find one person, and two, focus on one thing.
I mean, just turn a question back. You went to the RCMP. Have you begun any dialogue with CSEC? Because the natural academic partner in the United States is NSA and Centers of Academic Excellence. I'm just curious whether the NSA equivalent is part of your game plan.
No, we haven't targeted them as of yet, but I mean, as I said, I've only been there a year. I just joined in September, so we've been really trying to get things off the ground. But the number one obstacle that I've faced thus far has been this real reluctance and resistance from the government to partner with us. And in fact, the RCMP has expressed some interest, but they're just moving so slowly, and they have all of their security clearances and this and that, and which I can understand, but it seems like it's just very slow. And you know, as well, in my research, even as a grad student and doing my PhD in law, I wrote on my thesis on child pornography, and it was virtually impossible to get any kind of reliable statistics because nobody is working in that area, and there's very little interest in the part of government to do anything about it.
So taking and building on John's point, public safety is the lead for all cybersecurity in Canada, and as in the United States, they're responsible for the all of government strategy, and your person of interest is Bob Gordon, because that's the person who's responsible for leading the entire strategy. There are a number of research partnerships between the United States and Canada on cybercrime and on child pornography, but as you start to look at the different partnerships you could forge from a university level, you might want to look at who's the university partners to those programs in the United States and or the United Kingdom, and work those alliances to work your way into the Canadian national strategy. And Doug is working with Harvard and MIT and a whole bunch of others on some interesting of how do you get to the data, because we're having a very difficult time getting to the data to enable the research community. This is something that we highlighted in the cyberspace policy review, and Doug's had the most success in it, and I think that it would be good if he talked a little bit about that.
So actually, there's a couple things I would want. One, I think, as Melissa mentioned, public safety is the Canadian center point, but we have been having dialogues with the law enforcement community in the U.S. DHS is now the largest law enforcement agency in the U.S. with Secret Service and others, and it's probably worth having the discussion about. We've had, you know, even dialogues where the Secret Service and the FBI are talking. I know that's you're not supposed to do that, Robert, but no, seriously, it's been great to have this, you know, everybody's getting along, and so it might be useful to have that discussion about the communications they're having with their Canadian counterparts and see if there isn't some way to help you connect with people there. The data problem is an issue, and we're trying to work some of those data issues. We have not stepped into the what I would call much more controversial data that associated with child pornography. We've largely stayed on the doable side so far with respect to network traffic and other kinds of things. The last thing I would point out is there are various agencies within the U.S. that have an ability to do collaborative R&D partnerships with non-U.S. universities. So NSF is one of them. DHS is as well. We have funded a significant amount, well, not a significant, a number of research projects where either a lead performer or a subcontractor was a foreign university or foreign company. So we in fact do fund outside the U.S. and have done essentially since day one. So that's another mechanism to look at additional funding dollars is possibly, if there's no funding dollars coming out of the Canadian side, there is opportunity possibly on the U.S. side.
Libations and accoutrements have entered the room, so I will make a few remarks and close. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us. As the adversary continues to out-innovate us, move at warp speed, they do not have the challenges that we do with ethics, morals, corporate governance, privacy, budget, territory issues, etc. We cannot advance the security field with existing models. We need to think out of the box. Collaboration will be key. Creating centers of excellence when you bring the practitioner and the theory together, looking for change agents, and moving from me to we. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you over at the refreshment center.